Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video for History Valley Podcast. Today, I'm joined by Russell Gmirkin, and today we're going to be discussing his book, Berosus and Genesis, Manifu and Exodus, Hellenistic Histories and the Date of the Penetuk. And I'll have the link to purchase his book in the description to Amazon and to various other websites that carry his book. And we'll go from there. So welcome to the podcast again, Russell.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Yep, last time we were discussing the War Scroll, and now we've shifted to your thoughts on the Old Testament when it was composed. So I think I should start off with this question. Can you tell us about what began your journey to eventually questioning when the Pentateuch was composed, and what led you to the conclusion that the Pentateuch was composed during the Hellenistic period?
Certainly. I was working on another book, In Search of the Pillars of Hercules, that was investigating the possible historical basis for certain Greek myths that Hercules had set up these inscriptions in various parts of the world during his travels. So one of the sources that mentions that is Berosus, who was a Babylonian priest who wrote around 278 BC. So I got a hold of his all the surviving fragments of his book in a collection found in the University of Oregon. Photocopied it all, read it, and I was struck how incredibly close Berosus read like early Genesis. It had a creation, it had 10 generations before the flood, had the flood account, so on and so forth. And I was like, how is that possible? Because Berosus was not reading the Bible. So I just filed that under interesting, because I didn't know what to do with that, because Genesis was written, centuries earlier, according to most standard theories. Then I ran across the research of Niels Peter Lemke, who was a professor at the University of Copenhagen. And he said that the Pentateuch could have been written in the Hellenistic era. That the first evidence for it really was the Septuagint translation. And we don't know how much earlier than the Septuagint translation of around 270 BC the Pentateuch was actually written. So I thought, wow, that could explain the similarities with Berosus if Genesis was using Berosus instead of vice versa. So I did a systematic study of all the parallels between the cuneiform traditions, Genesis, Berosus, and I found that Genesis really resembles Berosus more than the earlier original cuneiform accounts that Berosus was largely reproducing. And so this led me to consider maybe Pentateuch was written late. And then I started considering other Greek sources that resemble the Pentateuch, also in the Hellenistic era, that everyone has assumed copied from the Bible. Hecatias of Abdera, Manetho with his stories of an exodus of the Hyksos to Jerusalem, and later figures and I kept on. Every time I would look at these Hellenistic era sources, all the evidence showed that they really were completely unaware of the biblical account, and that there's a definite relationship between the two in many cases, but it could only be explained by the Penetuk borrowing from these Greek sources. So that ultimately led to my book Berosus and Genesis, which I just wrote just out of sheer curiosity. And a friend of mine who was going to the University of Copenhagen at the time, Greg Doudna, he showed that to one of his professors, the famous Thomas L. Thompson, without my knowledge or asking him to. Thompson read it. He says, "We've got to publish this book." And so, you know, boom, the book got published. And I've been really one of the foremost scholars on the subject of Greek sources in the Pentateuch and the Hebrew Bible since then.
I want to take a shift to the sources for a moment, like the external sources, like the Elephantine Papyrie and other texts like it. You note that in your book that none of these sources appear to cite any of the texts in the Pentateuch.
Yeah, that's true. The Elephantine Papyrie in particular is an extremely relevant example. They were written in the military colony of Elephantine, which is at the first cataract of the Nile. It's an island there. And there were Jewish military colonists there to protect the border of Egypt against invasion from Ethiopia. And there were, in this dry Egyptian climate, there's this treasure trove of documents that from about 450 to 400 BC that were discovered at Elephantine, written by these Jewish military colonists. And they corresponded with Jerusalem. They, there's lots of legal deeds and this and that. There's not one reference in any of the Elephantine Papyri about any religious writings. No Moses, no Abraham, no David. They had their own temple at Elephantine in violation of the Deuteronomic code, and they were in communication with Jerusalem and Samaria. But evidently, it was not a problem. They had they knew a 7-day week, but they didn't observe the Sabbath because they have business documents written on Saturdays, and they have one boat owner who threatened an employee, "You have to pick up these vegetables on Saturday, or else I'll have you killed. You pick those up." So, it was just business as usual on Saturdays. And there's no evidence whatsoever that any biblical writings were in existence as late as 400 BC, basically on the eve of the Hellenistic era, which is, of course, after Alexander the Great conquered the East in, the 330s, 320s BC. So that's a huge scandal that there's no support for biblical literature or many biblical customs among the Jews at Elephantine as late as around 400 BC.
So, in other words, they weren't necessarily following the commandments given in the Pentateuch, which indicates to you that the Pentateuch didn't exist at the time because they weren't following that code yet.
They weren't, and there were communications from Judea about religious matters that did not cite or quote the Pentateuch. There were many opportunities where they should have known about the Penetuk if it was in existence, but there's no evidence of that. There's a book by Gard Granerod, about the Elephantine colony and all the literature, and how this polytheistic, they worship multiple gods, including at the temple. Polytheistic Judaism was evidently the norm at that time. The Elephantine were not some heterodox exception. This is just contemporary evidence of what the religion of Yahweh looked like at that time. One of his professors said, "Yeah, that's really the elephant in the room," because it flies in the face of all this long tradition of scholarship that assumes that these biblical books were written centuries earlier. And there's just no evidence, and the contemporary evidence points in exactly the opposite direction. Penetuk's a late literature.
So shifting back to the Septuagint, you state that the Septuagint and the Hebrew Bible, you believe, were written around the same time. Do you think that the Septuagint is basically a Greek translation of that? Like in other words, were they translating it into Greek simultaneously?
Yeah, they wrote it in Hebrew. Clearly, the Pentateuch was written in Hebrew. It's a very wooden translation, literal, word for word, into the Greek. So they wrote it in Hebrew, translated it practically immediately into Greek. Basically, two editions. One Hebrew edition, one Greek edition. Very similar to the Darius Law Code of about a century earlier in Egypt that had all the laws of Egypt that were published. And they were published both in Demotic, which was the local Egyptian language, and at the same time Aramaic, which was the universal language of the Persian Empire at that time. So the Egyptian laws came out in two languages simultaneously, and the same model seems to be true for the Hebrew Pentateuch.
Do you think that the Pentateuch is combining theology and stories that we see in Greek literature with Mesopotamian literature, like borrowing from Berosus and Plato and other similar sources like them, and consolidating it into the Pentateuch?
Yeah, that's fairly accurate. What I found in Berosus and Genesis there were all these Greek sources, um, running right up to like 273, 272 BC, which is virtually the same time as the Septuagint translation, which we know was from 273 to 269 BC. So I found you have the Greek sources that were found in the Great Library of Alexandria, and at virtually the same time, tradition says Jewish and Samaritan scholars were invited to Alexandria to create an edition of the Laws of Moses for the Great Library. So you have all these Jewish scholars in the Great Library of Alexandria, which was the center of learning of the whole world at that time. They had access to Berosus, Manetho, Plato, Hecatias, Homer, Hesiod, the whole gamut of Greek literature. That's where they were working under royal patronage of Ptolemy II Philadelphus. And they were creating an edition of, the Pentateuch and the Laws of Moses for the Great Library. So the Great Library was the center of all of this. where the sources were. It's where I say it was written, and then it was where it was immediately translated as a prestige edition for the Greek Library. So I think it all happened with these bilingual Jewish and Samaritan scholars who knew Greek and Hebrew in Alexandria around 270 BC, 272, 273. And they put them all together, all these various sources. They consolidated them, yes.
When you look at the documentary hypothesis and the different sources that are discussed in Old Testament scholarship, like E, P, D, and J, do you think those sources could potentially be earlier, or do you think those sources and traditions emerged much later?
I consider those to be separate sources. Basically, four voices that each contributed to the Penetuk. But unlike the documentary hypothesis, there's really no evidence that J was in 900 BC and E 800 BC, and the Deuteronomist in 600 and something BC, the priestly source, and in the Persian era. I think they were all contemporary. Tradition said that it was a team of scholars at Alexandria, Jewish and Samaritan, and the tradition said it took 70 scholars to translate the books of Moses into Greek. Septuagint scholars say no, it was maybe 2 or 3, because we can detect these different people doing the translating. So why were there so many scholars there? Well, the J Yahweh source, these were probably Jewish scholars, because a lot of their stories involved Judea. And the E source were probably Samaritan scholars, because a lot of those take place a little bit further north. And the Deuteronomists and the priests, those were other groups. They were all collaborating on this together. They're all intertwined. They're basically contemporary. It was a team effort. Sometimes you have J using E. Sometimes you have E using J. Sometimes J uses P. Sometimes P uses J. So they were all working together, copying each other. Sometimes some stories, like the Joseph story, appears to have been co-written by J and E, the Yahwist and the Elohist, because they can separate those two parts of the Joseph story. But when you divide the novella into two parts like that, neither part make any sense. But they make a beautiful story when they're together. So, you had J authors and E authors together in the same room working on this as a team. Anyway, that's my model. It's like a documentary hypothesis, but it's a collaborative model. It's very similar, again, like the laws of Darius, codified in 500 and something BC, because they had priests, they had warriors, and they had scribes, 3 different teams that collected together those laws and put together the laws of Darius in 8 volumes. There's a lot of collaborative, collective authorship going on back in that day. So I have no problems with the distinct sources, but I just view them all as contemporary, basically in the same room together.
So basically what you're saying is, in the current conception of the documentary hypothesis, it's too hypothetical and they're basically too arbitrarily dated without any strong evidence for them.
Yeah. I wrote an article in the documentary Hypothesis Be Rehabilitated for Robert Price's journal, the Journal of Higher Criticism. And it goes through the evidence and shows lots of evidence that they were intertwined, contemporary, and not one century succeeding another after another. That's just hypothetical pie in the sky scholarship without any basis in evidence. Yeah, so I meet the documentary hypothesis halfway. It does have some strong points in terms of identifying different voices, but the chronology is without any evidence at all.
So let's talk about how the authors of the Penetuk formed characters such as Moses, for example. When you look at Moses to see how they formed the mythological background of this man, did they basically? I mean, what you say is they basically took Plato's laws and they took stuff from Manifu and maybe Hecatias, because I know you mentioned that Hecatias, if I remember correctly, is the oldest reference to the Moses guy.
Yeah.
And they coalesced the different versions of Moses and sprinkles of Plato like salt and just sprinkled it on Moses, basically.
Yeah, sure. That sounds fair enough. Yeah, the basic outline of the Exodus story was found in the writings of Hecataeus of Dara around 320 to 315 BC. He had a fictional foundation story, a typical Greek foundation story, in which an Egyptian named Moses set out from Egypt with a colonizing expedition to Judea, which was completely uninhabited at the time. And he established its capital, Jerusalem, built its temple, established its constitution and laws, and divided it into 12 tribes, like Plato recommended, and basically instituted all the ancient customs of the Jews. And this is one of many fictional foundation stories in Hecataeus. And obviously was not acquainted with the biblical account at all because it contradicts it at virtually every point. But he wrote this in a book called the Egyptiaca, or the History of Egypt, that he wrote for the Ptolemies. And it was used to educate the young princes, including Ptolemy II Philadelphus. So they were all familiar with these traditions from Hecataeus, including this fictional foundation story, which was meant to aggrandize the Egyptians who colonized the world. They colonized Babylonia and Athens, and there's all sorts of fictional stories to that effect. So in the time of Ptolemy Philadelphus, they thought there was a figure named Moses, an Egyptian, who gave the Jews their ancient constitution and laws. And because the people who created the Great Library, they wanted it to have all the books in the world, and especially their legal section. They wanted all the laws in the world for reference. So they sent to the Jews and said, hey, we want a copy of those laws of Moses that we keep hearing about, that Hecataeus wrote about. And, the Jews and Samaritans said, sure, why not? We'll comply. We'll come to Alexandria, as you're inviting, and we'll put together a set of Mosaic laws. So Manetho had also he had a couple kind of scandalous foundation stories of the Jews that said that they were wicked Asiatics who had overthrown the Egyptians, and the Egyptians had to expel them back into Judea because they were such scoundrels. And so the Penetuk also countered some of Manetho and kind of turned that on its head and said, we didn't destroy all the gods of Egypt. The Egyptians were attacking our God, and we didn't enslave the Egyptians, they enslaved us, so on and so forth. So there's some polemics in there too, but a lot of borrowing going on. And if you look at the legal codes of Moses, a lot of that comes out of Plato, out of Plato's laws and other Greek laws. So they were drawing on various sources and reacting to them in various ways, and borrowing what they could that fit in with this Ptolemaic mandate. And they came up with the story of Moses. Much like Plato recommended, he said, if you're going to have a set of laws, the best way to guarantee that they'll stay through time is you have to persuade everybody that they were ancient and divine and had never been changed. And then people superstitiously will stay very loyal to them throughout time. And that's pretty much what was done with the Penetuk. They created an ancient foundation story. They gave their laws a divine origin, just like Plato said. And they followed his literary agenda. So you see multiple Greek sources and traditions in the Penetuk, in my understanding of it.
And what is curious is you point out in the book that Hecatias and Manifu, of course, strikingly never mentioned the Pentateuch when they discuss Moses.
That's true. And the Hecatias, he said he consulted all sorts of Egyptian priests when he was writing his book. And Manetho, of course, was an Egyptian priest. He said that this one, well, the Egyptians had native stories how Asiatics would periodically invade Egypt, commit outrages against the gods, and then they'd have to be ejected. One such group was the Hyksos, the shepherd kings. And Manetho told this story about how they were ejected out of Egypt and founded Jerusalem and its temple a long, long time ago. And then a later one was this Egyptian priest of the god of chaos, Seth Typhon. His name was Osir-Seth, and he led this band of lepers in alliance with the Hyksos. They ravaged Egypt, and they were expelled into Judea too. And Manetho adds, and some people say Osir-Seth is the same as Moses, where he's referring to Moses from Hecatias, not Moses from the Jewish Bible, because none of his stories resemble the biblical Exodus at all. I mean, they're local, authentic Egyptian stories. But he said that some people in his day were slanderously saying that this leper priest, Osir-Seth, was the same as the guy Moses that Hecatias was writing about. So you have, that's the second mention of Moses in ancient literature. But he didn't know anything about Jewish writings either, and his writings betray nothing from the Penetuk. But the Penetuk reacts against him quite energetically. So the Penetuk has to be younger than Hecatias. It has to be younger than Manifu and Berosus. And that gets you right close down to the time of the Septuagint translation.
But the more striking thing, of course, is that Manifu, who is writing significantly later than Hecatias, still did not mention the Pentateuch, and he knew more about the Jewish people than presumably Hecatias ever did. Let's shift to discussing the fall of man and Adam. Do you see Adam in the book of Genesis as a synthesis of the fall of man under the Prometheus scenario, perhaps, and with a mix of the Adapa myth and other Mesopotamian myths?
Well, Adam was created out of the earth, much like Prometheus created humans out of clay and water. There were several Greek myths that talked about humans in various countries being fashioned out of the earth by the gods in those different regions. So there's definitely some echoes of the Greek myths there. Prometheus too, he revealed all the arts of civilization to humanity: fire, shipbuilding, how to build houses and clothing, and because man in the Prometheus story and in most Greek myths, the original humans were naked and defenseless, and they needed technology to survive. They needed civilization right from the outset, and that sort of knowledge was only provided by the gods. They possessed that sort of knowledge. You have something similar in the Mesopotamian myths, where there were some creatures called the Apkallu, who were half fish and half human. They were semi-divine creatures, and they were so wise. There were 7 of them, and they visited the earliest humans that were created by Marduk, and and they came and they taught humans the arts of civilization. So, and everyone's compared those to the Prometheus myth. It's very similar, the Greek traditions and the Mesopotamians in that regard. So what you really have is a contrast between this Eden with Adam and Eve living in a paradise, not having to work for a living, just eating the fruit off of all the trees. Very similar to the first age of Kronos in Greek myth. And then after the age of Kronos, you have the age of Zeus, where in the age of Kronos, the ground just produced fruits automatically. Humans could talk to animals. They didn't need clothes. Everything was wonderful. And then in the age of Zeus, all that was taken away. They had to learn agriculture, technology. And Prometheus showed them those arts. Zeus got very mad at him for that. And in the Mesopotamian myths, Apkallu showed humans the arts of civilization. So it mixes in from both worlds. The authors of early Genesis, some of them were probably Babylonian Samaritans, who had a strong background in Babylonian traditions. So that's why they drew on Berosus and the Mesopotamian flood tradition and a lot of Babylonian material in early Genesis, as well as Greek. So they had one foot in each world because they were very educated, well read in world literature, and they also had a preference for Babylonian traditions due to their ethnic background. The Book of Kings talks about how when Samaria fell and the northern kingdom came to an end, that there was a colony of Babylonians that were brought to Samaria. And, they continued down to the Hellenistic era. You can trace some of their literary and intellectual activities. And so you see a lot of Babylonian and Assyrian influences in the Jewish Bible and the Pentateuch.
If you could you provide what you would say is one of the best examples of the Pentateuch combining material from Hellenistic literature with Mesopotamian literature? And the reason I ask is because some people might say, well, when they comb through the Pentateuch, they only see Mesopotamian parallels, but they are having a difficult time finding a Hellenistic parallel.
Sure. Everyone agrees that the main plot line of the flood in Genesis 9 through 10, whatever, 6 through 9, say, it's Mesopotamia. It comes from the Epic of Atrahasis that was found in, I think, Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh. So it's a Mesopotamian flood story. They had an ark. They had people getting aboard the ark with animals. They had the birds being released. All of that very clearly Mesopotamian. But the lead up to the flood, though, was very different. In Mesopotamian literature, the gods got annoyed because of all these noisy humans. The gods couldn't get to sleep, so they said, let's wipe them out. They're disturbing our rest. And that was the reason why the gods sent the flood. In the biblical account, it's an ethical degeneration. You have the sons of God intermarrying with beautiful humans. They create this race of Nephilim, or warriors, giants, men of renown. And but then through time, they become corrupt. Everything becomes violent and wicked, and so the flood is sent as punishment on the humans. Well, that's Greek, and specifically that's Plato's Critias, which was the story of Atlantis. In the story of Atlantis, Poseidon was the god who ruled Atlantis. He married a beautiful human girl, had 10 offspring, the kings of Atlantis. The first was Atlas, who, was a giant. And they were wonderful for a long time, but over time, they became corrupt. Every generation, these semi-divine rulers would marry human women. And so the human part got stronger and the divine part became weakened until eventually they were just like normal human kings who are violent and lawless and ambitious. And Zeus said, enough is enough. And I'm going to send earthquakes, rain, and flood and destroy this continent of Atlantis that was so wicked and lawless that they sent fleets of ships to invade the Mediterranean and take over and enslave the whole world. Plato's story of Atlantis said the Athenians fought them off heroically and, stood to the bitter end. And then this earthquake and flood wiped them out. So other than, that is the only other ancient story that has a moral cause for this world flood. The next time you see it is in Ovid Metamorphosis, which is like 1st century BC. But back in the time when Genesis was written, the 270s, Plato, he was the only other one who turned it into this ethical drama where the flood was to purge humans of wickedness and to give humanity a new fresh start. So here you have Mesopotamian elements, the flood story, with Noah and the ark, and it's combined with this whole Greek Atlantis story with gods marrying beautiful women and having gigantic offspring, and then the world degenerating, and that's why there was a flood. So there's a good example of the Greeks and the Babylonian myths being combined. I think that's one of the best ones, and I talk about this a lot in my latest book, Plato's Timaeus and the Biblical Creation Account.
Right, we discussed that in our first interview.
Yeah.
So what do you think the motivation was to put together the Hebrew Pentateuch? Was it for the same reasons the Septuagint was put together, or for a different?
Well, it was basically the same project. I mean, the project was initiated by agents from Ptolemy II Philadelphus, who had heard about Moses and his laws in ancient times, how Moses wrote the Jewish constitution and laws, and he wanted a copy for the Great Library. So he sent the request. The Jews, in collaboration with Samaritans, who were probably a little more literate and educated, they went to Alexandria and they complied, and they left the copy in Greek for the Great Library because that's what Ptolemy wanted. They also got a copy of the Hebrew too, but the Greek was that was really meant for public distribution to the civilized world, whereas the Hebrew edition they brought back with them, and that became the new national laws and law code and way of life of the Jews, who basically reinvented their national way of life around 270 BC. Up to that time, they'd just been a normal government with a governor, and then over to one side you had the high priest and the temple. But starting in 270 BC, they had a theocracy, a reinvented form of government that was a new type of government that Plato advocated in Plato's laws, where the nation would be ruled with divine ancient laws and by a ruling council of high priests and theologians and experts in the law. So, so the Pentateuch was meant to be an authoritative set of new laws to govern the new reinvented Jewish nation as of about 270 BC. So there was a domestic market, and then there was an international market. It was on two tracks.
Well, I think we can end there. So thanks for joining me once again, Russell.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.